After treaty. Impact of the Indian Act. First Nations cultures lost their customs, traditions, and languages. First Nations family ties were broken. First Nations children were removed from their families. First Nations people's freedom of movement was restricted. First Nations women were discriminated against. First Nations peoples were not allowed to practice their spiritual ceremonies. First Nations people lost their identity through enfranchisement. First Nations people lost their self-confidence. First Nations parents lost their parenting skills. The First Nations lost the right to determine their own membership. The First Nations lost their traditional leadership. The First Nations lost their sovereignty. The First Nations have only limited access to education. The First Nations lost their lands. The First Nations lost their resources. The First Nations lost their traditional lifestyles. The First Nations lost their freedom. The First Nation only have limited opportunity to sell their agricultural goods.